The pregnancy test in Rachel Kim's purse had been negative for 18 months now. She sat in the Family Feud waiting area unconsciously touching her flat stomach, a gesture that had become automatic after 6 pregnancies that never made it past 12 weeks. Her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had buried dreams that never had a chance to breathe. "You sure you're ready for this?" her husband David whispered beside her. Rachel nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she thought about all the baby showers she'd declined, all the nurseries she'd never finished decorating. This was supposed to be healing, a distraction from the monthly disappointment that had become their life. The Kim family from Portland had been selected after David submitted their application during one of Rachel's darkest periods. It was his attempt to get her out of the house, away from the empty room they'd prepared 6 different times for babies who never came home. The prize money could help with the mounting medical bills, but mostly he wanted to see her smile again. Steve Harvey's voice filled the studio as the cameras prepared to roll. The energy was infectious and celebratory, designed to make families feel blessed and complete. But Rachel carried the weight of knowing her family would always feel incomplete, missing the children who existed only in her heart. She wore a loose-fitting green blouse that she'd bought during her last pregnancy. It was one of the few maternity clothes she couldn't bring herself to donate, though it now hung on her smaller frame like a reminder of what she'd lost. Every piece of clothing carried memories of hope that had died. The game began with its usual excitement. The Kim family faced the Johnson family from Texas in what should have been a joyful competition. Steve worked his magic, drawing laughs and creating those moments of connection that made the show special. Rachel stood at the end of her family's podium. She tried to participate when the cameras focused on her, but every question about family felt loaded. What defined family when yours kept disappearing before it could form? "Survey says," Steve announced, as the first round progressed. The Kim family was doing well, their answers lighting up the board with encouraging frequency. David kept glancing at his wife, hoping to see some spark of the woman she'd been before loss became their constant companion. The studio lights were bright and warm. For most contestants, they represented hope and possibility. For Rachel, they felt exposing, as if everyone could see the emptiness inside her, where 6 babies should have grown, but never did. During a commercial break, Steve worked the audience as he always did. His natural charisma filled the studio, making strangers feel like family. He noticed Rachel immediately, standing quietly while celebration happened around her. There was something in her posture that caught his attention. The way she held herself carefully, like someone protecting something fragile that had already been broken too many times. Steve had learned to read people over decades of television, and Rachel was grieving something profound.
"You doing all right over there?"
Steve asked during the break, walking toward the Kim family podium. Rachel managed a weak smile that carried more sadness than joy. "Just thinking about what could have been," she replied softly. David stepped closer to his wife, protectively. "She's been through a lot recently," he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had watched his partner suffer repeatedly. "We both have." The cameras came back on. Steve returned to his position, but his eyes kept drifting to Rachel throughout the next round. Her family was winning, but she seemed disconnected from their success, present but lost in thoughts of different victories that never came. The fast money round arrived. David went first and scored 158 points. The family needed only 42 more points to win the $20,000, money that could help with fertility treatments they could no longer afford. Rachel stepped up to the podium. Her family cheered behind her, but she barely heard them through the fog of grief that had become her constant companion. The bright lights felt overwhelming, the studio audience vast, the pressure mounting in ways that had nothing to do with any game. "All right, Rachel," Steve said, his voice carrying its usual warmth. "You need 42 points to win $20,000 for your family. You ready?" Rachel nodded, though her hands shook as she gripped the podium, remembering all the positive pregnancy tests that had turned into heartbreak. The questions began with familiar rhythm. "Name something people wait for." "Good news," Rachel answered automatically. though she'd stopped believing good news would ever come. Every doctor's appointment had been bad news for 2 years. Name something that grows over time. Love. Name something people protect. Their children. Each answer came from a place of deep longing, from someone who had imagined protecting children who never made it into her arms. Name something people dream about at night. Rachel hesitated, thinking of the dreams where she held babies who felt so real she woke up, reaching for them. The future, she said quietly. Final question, Rachel. What do you dream of holding? The question hit her like a physical blow. Rachel's face went completely white as she stared at Steve. The carefully maintained composure she'd built over 6 losses began cracking under the weight of acknowledging what she wanted most. The studio waited. Her family waited. But Rachel couldn't speak because the question had reached into the deepest part of her grief and torn it open. She dreamed of holding babies every night, babies who would never exist. Rachel started, then stopped. Her breathing became shallow as 6 episodes of loss began rising in her chest. The bright lights suddenly felt like hospital lights where she'd heard heartbeats stop too many times. A baby that lives, she whispered. So quietly the microphones barely picked it up, but the cameras caught everything. The way her face crumpled, the tears that started flowing, the way she gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of episodes. He'd seen contestants struggle with difficult questions, seen them get emotional, seen them freeze under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. He set down his cards and walked toward Rachel. Not the measured walk of a television host, maintaining show pace, but the immediate response of a human being recognizing someone in devastating pain. The studio fell silent as all protocols were abandoned. Rachel, Steve said softly, reaching the podium. What's happening? Talk to me. Behind the scenes, Rachel made a decision that would change everything. She looked up at Steve, tears streaming down her face, and let 6 years of accumulated grief pour out. I've been pregnant 6 times, she said, her voice breaking. 6 times I saw heartbeats on ultrasounds. 6 times I told David we were going to be parents. And 6 times I watched our babies die before I could hold them. The words echoed across the studio like a confession of the deepest kind of loss. Audience members shifted uncomfortably, many dealing with their own fertility struggles. Camera operators continued filming, knowing they were witnessing something far beyond entertainment. The longest I carried was 12 weeks. Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger through the tears. I saw fingers and toes on the ultrasound. We picked out names, we told our families, and then the heartbeat stopped. The studio was completely silent. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on quick responses and perfect timing, found himself in territory no game show had ever prepared him for. This wasn't television anymore. This was someone's deepest maternal grief laid bare. Rachel, Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance. How long have you been trying? The question was gentle, giving her permission to tell the story that had been consuming her life. 8 years, Rachel whispered. We started trying when I was 20. Everyone said we were young, we had time. But time became our enemy. Every month that passed without getting pregnant, every pregnancy that ended in loss. David was crying now, standing at the family podium, watching his wife finally speak the words they'd whispered to each other in hospital rooms and empty nurseries. He had watched her blame herself for failures that weren't her fault. Steve looked at David, then back at Rachel. In that moment, he understood something profound about the difference between wanting children and losing them repeatedly. And the doctors? He asked gently. They don't know why, Rachel replied. All my tests are normal. David's tests are normal. They call it unexplained recurrent pregnancy loss, which means we keep losing babies and no one knows how to stop it. The helplessness in her voice was devastating. We've spent $60,000 on fertility treatments, she continued. IVF, genetic testing, experimental procedures. We've remortgaged our house twice. and we have nothing to show for it except medical bills and empty rooms. Steve Harvey had made people laugh for decades. But in this moment, he learned something about the difference between entertaining people and witnessing the cost of unfulfilled dreams. He did something unprecedented in television history. He walked around the podium and pulled Rachel into his arms. Not a quick, camera-friendly embrace, but the kind of hug that says, "Your loss is real. Your grief is valid." The kind that transfers strength from one human being to another. "Rachel," he said, still holding her, "I want you to listen to me very carefully." He pulled back to look at her directly. "You are not broken. You are not being punished. You are not less of a woman because your body can't carry babies to term." The audience began to respond, not with applause, but with sounds of recognition, of shared pain. Many women were crying openly, touched by the raw honesty of someone speaking about losses that society often ignores. "You see," Steve continued, "some people think miscarriage is just a medical event. But you know it's not. Every one of those babies was real to you. Every one of those losses was a death in your family." But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel just showed us what invisible grief looks like. What it means to lose children that no one else got to meet. What it costs to keep hoping when hope keeps breaking your heart." His voice carried across the studio with absolute conviction. "She's been carrying this alone, thinking that talking about dead babies makes people uncomfortable. Thinking that her grief doesn't count because her children never took a breath." The audience erupted. Not in the programmed applause of a television taping, but in genuine recognition of loss they had just witnessed. This was maternal grief and unfulfilled dreams, and the courage to keep trying made visible. "Rachel," Steve continued, turning back to her, "you asked what you dream of holding. I want to tell you something. You have been holding those babies. In your heart, in your dreams, in the love you gave them during the weeks they were with you. Those 6 babies were real. They mattered. They changed you. And the love you have for them doesn't disappear just because they did." Rachel was sobbing now, but the tears felt different. They weren't just tears of loss anymore. They were tears of recognition, of finally hearing that her babies mattered, that her grief was valid, that love doesn't require living children. "But I want to be a mom so badly," Rachel whispered. "I want to hold a baby that cries, that grows up, that calls me mama. What if it never happens? What if I'm meant to be childless forever?" The fear in her voice was heartbreaking. "Rachel," Steve replied firmly, "being a mother isn't just about giving birth, it's about loving unconditionally, and you've been loving 6 children unconditionally, even though they never made it home." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Without explanation, he dialed a number while the cameras continued rolling. The conversation was brief, conducted in whispers that only Rachel could hear. When he finished, he looked back at her with something approaching hope. "Rachel, I just spoke to some friends of mine, people who understand pregnancy loss, who work with families dealing with infertility. We're going to make sure you get support that goes beyond medical treatment." The Johnson family, who had been watching this unfold from their podium, abandoned their competitive position entirely. They walked across the stage and surrounded Rachel, their opponents becoming her support system in a matter of minutes. "You know what?" Steve announced to the studio. "Both families win today, because today we learned something more valuable than any prize money could teach us." He looked directly into the main camera. "We learned that miscarriage is not a failure, that women who lose pregnancies are not broken, that grief for babies who never took a breath is real grief that deserves support, not silence." The audience rose to their feet, not in the programmed applause of a television taping, but in genuine recognition of courage they had just witnessed. Rachel stood surrounded by strangers who had become family, held up by love that transcended her losses. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. Steve removed his suit jacket, the one he wore for every taping, and gently placed it around Rachel's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me through every show," he said. It's seen winners and losers, joy and sorrow. But today, it's going to wrap around someone who showed us what it means to love children you never got to raise. Someone who taught us that being a mother starts the moment you find out you're pregnant, not the moment you give birth. The jacket was warm and substantial, making Rachel feel protected in a way she hadn't experienced since her first positive pregnancy test. It felt like being acknowledged, like her motherhood being recognized even without living children. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something unprecedented happened. People didn't leave immediately. They approached Rachel one by one, sharing their own stories of pregnancy loss, of infertility, of dreams deferred. A woman who had miscarried twins, a man whose wife had struggled with recurrent loss, a teenager whose mother had told her about the siblings she'd never met. Each person who spoke to Rachel added another thread to a tapestry of shared grief she hadn't known existed. Steve stayed with her through it all. This wasn't publicity or show business. This was community forming around shared understanding of reproductive grief. Proof that speaking about taboo losses creates connection and healing. The episode aired 5 months later, exactly as it had been filmed. No editing to soften Rachel's breakdown. No removing of the hard truths she had spoken. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Pregnancy loss support organizations reported increased funding. Hospitals began offering better grief counseling for miscarriage. But most importantly, women began talking openly about losses they'd carried in silence. Rachel became an advocate for pregnancy loss awareness, speaking about the hidden grief that affects 1 in 4 pregnancies. She appeared on Steve's talk show a year later, not as someone still trying to get pregnant, but as someone who had found purpose in her pain. The business card Steve had given her led to resources that transformed her grief journey. Support groups where she met other women who understood the specific pain of losing multiple pregnancies. Counseling that helped her separate her worth from her fertility. Steve's jacket became a symbol Rachel shared with other lost mothers in her support group. She wore it to her first speaking engagement, where she talked about the difference between being childless and being a mother to children in heaven. 2 years later, Rachel had an answer to Steve's question. She dreamed of holding babies that lived, but she had been holding babies all along. In her heart, in her memories, in the love that didn't end when their heartbeats stopped. She learned that pregnancy loss doesn't disqualify you from motherhood. It's a different kind of motherhood. That loving children you never got to raise is still love. That grief for babies who never breathed is still valid grief. Today, Rachel works with hospitals to improve pregnancy loss support. She and David eventually adopted a daughter, but she tells people that her family includes not just her living child, but the 6 babies who made her a mother first. Steve Harvey still keeps a photo from that day in his dressing room. Not a professional shot, but a candid moment of Rachel surrounded by strangers who had become family. It reminds him that sometimes the most important television happens when people tell the truth about losses society doesn't want to acknowledge. The studio audience from that day formed an informal support network for pregnancy loss that continues to this day. They check on each other during difficult anniversaries, offer support during subsequent pregnancies, and prove that witnessing someone's grief creates lasting bonds. Rachel's story proves that miscarriage is not a medical statistic, it's the loss of a hoped-for future. That women who lose pregnancies are not broken. They're mothers grieving children they loved but never got to raise. That sometimes healing begins when someone finally says your babies mattered. Because Rachel Kim wasn't just a woman who couldn't stay pregnant. She was a mother to 6 babies who existed in ultrasound photos and heartbeats and dreams. And that kind of love, that kind of motherhood, deserves recognition even when it doesn't result in living children. And sometimes, the most important acknowledgement is simply hearing that you are a mother, even if your babies are in heaven instead of your arms.